Writing Comics. Lecture 3 on Reading Comics, in which we'll get under the hood a bit to talk about what makes comic books work, why they're inherently different from film or prose, and at the same time equally valid as a form of entertainment, education, and self-expression. Hey, I'm still Stefan Petruka, and I'll begin this lecture with another anecdote because, well, sometimes people like them. So there I was, promoting the Nancy Drew graphic novels at the annual New York Book Expo, when an attendee approached, glanced at our hard work on the iconic Girl Detective, and said with a wistful shrug, "Now kids don't have to read them." After all, it was a comic book, not a book. For me, that offhand comment neatly captured three long-standing and completely incorrect beliefs about comics. First, that the content is at best superficial, and at worst, emotionally, intellectually, or morally damaging. Second, that the form itself is somehow inherently inferior to, say, books. And third, perhaps most interestingly, that comics somehow aren't read. This first bit of nonsense has not only been around a long time, over centuries it's been applied to all sorts of things, from 1890s dime novels to 1950s horror comics, which, by the way, brought about a congressional hearing on how they cause juvenile delinquency. It even goes up to everyone's favorite idiot box, television, and most recently to the terrible video games of today, which are, as we speak, turning the billions of people who play them into mindless, desensitized killers. And oh yeah, cell phones. Funny thing though, it even goes all the way back to the first mass-produced novels. You know, books. I have seen two poor disconsolate parents drop into premature graves, miserable victims to their daughter's dishonor. And was novel reading the cause of this? I answer yes. That's from Novel Reading, A Cause of Female Depravity, published 1797. And if it sounds familiar by now, it should. The second issue relates directly to the medium itself, as if there's some core component of a given communication mode that prevents it from producing anything other than drivel. It's why television was once called the boob tube, despite the stunning dramas aired on it since the 1950s. And many still have no idea that video games can be used to tell stories with novel-like depth. Whenever this, unreasoning fear gets applied to something new, its proponents always insist, no, this time it's different, when it's demonstrably not. In other countries, such as France or Japan, comics are accepted as a valid art form, right along film, and yes, books. In the US, however, this peculiar bias remains. To be completely fair, more and more United States educators look to comics for reluctant readers, but they're still primarily used to draw students into books, the real thing, rather than as an end unto themselves. Despite many inroads into high literature by author-artists such as Art Spiegelman with Maus, or Marjane Satrapi with Persepolis, to name just two, the combination of words and pictures is still often considered somehow less. Why? No doubt, a lot of factors shape this attitude, but the argument itself seems based on that third belief, that comics aren't read. They're, looked at in some weird way that doesn't deeply engage the mind. But this objection implies an even more ridiculous corollary argument, that visually communicated information is inferior to written communication. That much is easily disproven. While pictures and words have their own strengths and limitations, anyone moved by a great painting or photograph knows the incredible power of images. The other misconception is, I think, the big sticking point. Sure, everyone realizes you have to read what's in the balloons and the captions, but for some, having the pictures there makes a comic seem too easy to follow, more like a reading primer than the real deal, almost like it's cheating, as in, what, do I have to draw a picture for you? But a comic book isn't a reading primer. Unless, it's designed as one. Same as a book or a video might be. The thing is, in comics, the sequence of images and their relationship to the words have a grammar all their own. A grammar that's capable of communicating in ways as simple and as complex as any other language. There's actual research to back that up, including a 2012 study that showed that the same parts of the brain used in reading are also used to make sense of sequential images. But what are those parts of the brain doing? And what makes it as good or even better than reading a book or looking at a painting? In the case of any media, the brain is using some form of coded instructions to create a fictive world. Fictive simply meaning not real. If you're reading about something that actually happened, those events aren't happening while you're reading them, right? Your brain is providing a representation of those events. When reading prose, the brain does that by looking at a bunch of lines that it's been trained to interpret as words. I write dog, you picture a dog. I write bark, you hear the sound. Similarly, with a drawing, the brain interprets a bunch of flat lines as something occupying three-dimensional space. I show you this, you see a face. Of course, aside from a fictive physical world, words and pictures can also express the non-physical, things like inner states and abstract ideas. But I'd argue that this is only possible as a variation on the brain's ability to internally represent the physical. That's where it starts. We had to live in the world before we lived in our heads. But this is complicated enough, and I don't want to get too far out into the weeds. So, comics. When encountering the image in a comic book panel, the same as it does with any picture, the brain creates a fictive three-dimensional world. Now, however, it also creates 1. Any movement that the image implies, 2. Additional details based on the words, 3. A relationship between the images and the words, and 4. Any events taking place between the panels. So there are some extra steps, yes? Aside from that, though, is there anything different about the fictive world we get from comics than what we might get from other media? If you want to read, why not read a book? If you want to see a story in pictures, why not catch a film? What's the difference? Partly it's about control, partly your involvement in the process. In a book, you not only provide all the sounds and images, you can choose to read the same passage over and over, or skim ahead, deciding what to linger on and when to move forward or back. Your engagement with the fictive world vanishes the moment you stop thinking about it. In film or video, the images and sounds are provided for you, so you can't imagine either. And while you can certainly pause a video or walk out of a theater, the experience itself plays out in real time, beyond the control of the viewer. Comics exist between the two, providing visuals, but also more reader involvement and control. And that's part of it, but there's also a more subtle difference. To try to get at that, let's look at how 3 different media, film, prose, and comics, express the same event, an explosion. Here, film has a unique advantage. We see and hear the blast in real time. With a good sound system, we feel it rattle our bones. No description can do that. And any illustration at best presents a single moment frozen in time. Now, consider the thoughts of a character caught in that explosion. I don't know if my eyes were open or closed, but all I saw was a bright red-orange glow, as if I were an insect standing on the tip of a birthday candle. A numb, almost peaceful sensation washed over me. I assumed it meant I was already dead. And then the shockwave hit. Of course, an actor can say all that, no doubt better than I just did, but their voice is inherently external, making it by definition less intimate and less like thinking itself. In prose, the voice the reader hears is always their own, or at least generated by your mind, and in that sense yours. And it's generated as thought, by and in your brain. In a comic, the words would be broken up by balloons and captions. Prose presents them as an uninterrupted stream, again, closer to the feeling of consciousness itself. Because of that, I'd argue that prose gets closer to reproducing a character's thoughts in an explosion than film or comics. Film, the visceral aspects. Prose, the character's inner perspective. But what medium best conveys the character's thoughts and the explosion at the same time? In case you haven't guessed, because of the unique way it combines the 2 modes, it's comics. That may explain a bit about the medium's strengths, but not necessarily why the form can be so compelling with all sorts of content. I don't have a final answer for that, but I think at least part of the reason goes back to the way the brain constructs any fictive world, which, in turn, is based on the way it perceives and interprets reality. Specifically, the unavoidable difference in the way we see and the way we hear things. Also known as the ineluctable modality of the visual and the ineluctable modality of the auditory. Simply put, we always hear things in time, one sound after the other, but we always see things in space, one thing next to another. True, the alphabet does appear in space, and the letters are next to one another, but rather than images, they represent sounds. Indoctrinated since birth, when we read, those areas of the brain associated with hearing light up. So when it comes to a comic, the brain does double duty. And yes, I said duty. It's interpreting one bunch of lines as sounds that take place in time, while interpreting another bunch of lines as objects occupying space. That may seem like a long walk for a relatively simple conclusion, but I think that crossing of brain functions creates a pleasant, fun, natural high. So to come back around to that original anecdote about kids no longer having to read Nancy Drew now that they're graphic novels, I'd say that not only do you read when you look at a comic, you put in and potentially get back a lot more. Next up, it's time to get into the nuts and bolts with the writer's roll. For now, farewell, my brave hobbits.